Good morning. My name is Byron D. Brooks. I am a proud Black man from the city of Detroit. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm a current grad student pursuing dual master degrees from the School of Social Work and School of Education, and I will be performing a piece I entitled Stay Woke. I know sometimes it can hurt to harness the reality that we live in a world full of carnage. Society just continues to tarnish. How can our teachers, that's teaching our kids to be great, can barely manage to put a meal on their plate, just barely making over minimum wage, huh? What's up with that? How can a white officer kill a Black man in his very own home, but then later on, the Black man is portrayed as the problem? No X plus Y carry the Z, cause show me that's a solution, but it shows that Black is still that's pollution, huh? I'm from the D, but I still be making Illinois, cause I know that my people, they still need a voice. They still need to know the words that came from Du Bois, especially our young girls and boys. I'm talking about the concept of the double consciousness, which is a term concerning the internal conflict where one's identity is divided because the way you look at yourself and the way society does isn't in alignment. And sadly, as a race, since we were no longer considered slaves, since women were finding more jobs than the men, the Black man became enraged, and instead of embracing, we hated our own women, the same ones that carry and birth our own children. Trying to follow a European example has tarnished the Black family mantle. Eventually, welfare was utilized to get the Black man out of the home, but yet we blame our sisters for raising our young boys on their own. The media portrays us as savages and thugs. They try to plant the perception in your mind that all Black kids do is tote blocks and sell drugs, and as a Black man, I do not take this as a joke. My brothers and sisters, it's time that we as a people became woke. Death over bondage. Life over carnage. It said how folk would take ignorance rather than knowledge. Society would rather give you drugs over college because they don't want to see young Black folks prosper. AKs come from Russia. Coke comes from Peru. So tell me who sounds like the drug dealers to you. Stay woke. President Obama couldn't even sneeze, but yet 45 is allowed to attack millions in his tweets. Stay woke. And why is there still so many obstacles trying to keep certain people from casting a vote? Stay woke. How can a woman in a job have the same job, but yet the woman is paid less in the end? Stay woke. They raise millions for a wall, but wouldn't raise it for Flint. I guess that shows you that society doesn't care if our children's water is filled with. Stay woke. Hundreds of years ago, they took our ancestors and piled them up on a boat. But I declare on this day that there's one thing that they will never be able to take away from the souls of Black folk. And that's hope. Stay woke. Ashe.
Good morning. My name is Robert Sellers. I'm Vice Provost for Equity and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer here at the University of Michigan. I'm a middle-aged African-American male with a graying beard, wearing a blue suit, a light blue shirt, and a mauve tie, sitting in front of a background showing the U of M cube. As we start today's event, it's important that we acknowledge the people whose land we live and learn on. The University of Michigan is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single transfer to the University of Michigan. This was offered ceremonially as a gift through the treaty at the foot of the rapids so that their children could be educated. Through these words of acknowledgement, their contemporary and ancestral ties to the land and their contributions to the university are both renewed and reaffirmed. So welcome to the 6th Annual DEI Summit Community Assembly at the University of Michigan. The title of this year's summit is Parallel Pandemics, Addressing Structural Racism in the Age of COVID-19. This year's summit focuses on how the twin pandemics of structural racism and COVID-19 have impacted our university, our country, and our world. Before we go any further, please join me in acknowledging the moving performance of Mr. Byron Brooks, who's a master's candidate in the School of Social Work and Education, who got us started off this morning with such a moving performance. Today's community assembly kicks off a month of summit activities commemorating the conclusion of the University of Michigan's first 5-year DEI strategic plan. It's really hard to believe that 5 years has gone by so quickly. At the same time, we've accomplished so many things in that period of time. And I invite you to visit report.dei.umich.edu and read in great depth about the great work that is being carried out across this entire university. During this morning's assembly and across the many other summit events, we'll engage with each other across a variety of activities and through a variety of modalities with a simple goal of eliciting thoughtful reflection, stimulating penetrating dialogue, as well as motivating respectful engagement and ultimately inspiring impactful action that will transform our community. We hope that the summit events will challenge and inspire each of us to rededicate ourselves to first, be the change that we hope to see in others, and then second, to work to actively dismantle structures that prevent everyone from having an equitable opportunity to succeed personally and to contribute to our common good. I urge you to please use today's events as an opportunity to learn and grow. And as you do so, please keep the conversation going online by using the hashtag UMICHDEI, UMICHDEI. Now, it is my honor to introduce our next speaker. Over the past 7 years, I've had the privilege of working closely with Mark Schlissel on issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as other issues facing the University of Michigan. Although we didn't know each other at all prior to when we first started our positions on July 1st, 2014, he has gone on to become a trusted and valued friend. As one might imagine, though, I was a bit apprehensive about who Mark was and what his position was on issues related to DEI when we first started. In reality, I figured if he was at least willing to state publicly that he was committed to DEI, that we could then leverage that in our efforts to transform the university. In all honesty, I was willing to settle for him just not getting in the way. Needless to say, though, I was very pleased when I heard him say in our conversation that DEI was going to be one of the pillars upon which he hoped to build his presidency. It turned out that Mark's commitment to DEI was far greater than I could have ever hoped for. As we began to talk about the DEI plan and Mark began to share with me his vision for the university, it became clear to me, crystal clear to me, that he was serious about this, that it was not just simply lip service. As Mark spoke more and more publicly about his belief that DEI is inextricably linked to our educational mission, my fellow CDOs at other institutions started calling me and asking me if he was for real. They all asked me how I was able to get him to say those things. And of course, being the honest and truthful person that I am, I said it was magic. But in reality, these were all things that Mark believes deeply in his heart. They've all of my CDO colleagues have said how fortunate I am to have had him as president, someone who is supportive and is willing to be a leader in this particular space. And I agree. Because being the leader in this space is not easy. It means that you are an easy, invisible target, and that no matter what you do, you can never get it quite right for everyone. There are those who criticize you for speaking out too much and too loudly. And then there are those who criticize you for not speaking out enough or loudly enough. And this, you can't win either way predicament can lead one to look for the easy way out, perhaps the most popular way out when saying things, or the most politically comfortable way out. But I'm here to tell you that that type of calculation never factored into a single decision that I saw Mark make. And every decision that I've seen him make, it is based on a genuine belief that that decision was in the best interest of the university. I am also very happy to report that that interest was always based on a genuine belief in the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, don't get me wrong, we didn't always agree about everything, but we did agree about most things. And in those rare occasions that we didn't agree, I always felt like he was willing to listen to what I had to say. And I can tell you as a CDO, one could never ask for anything more than that. So while there are literally hundreds, if not thousands of individuals responsible for all that we have and will accomplish in our DEI journey, Mark has been indispensable. Without his leadership, courage, and strong hands-on support, I do not believe that we would be here today. So as this is my last DEI summit as CDO, I want to take this personal opportunity to say publicly, simply, thank you, Mark. It has been a great ride together. So without any further delay, it is my pleasure to bring to you the 14th president of the University of Michigan, Mark S. Schlissel.
Wow. Well, thank you incredibly much, Rob, for that very kind introduction. Good morning, everybody. It's great to join you all virtually. A shout out to Byron Brooks for his spoken word eloquence and the provocative Stay Woke performance as well. Thanks, Brian. That was outstanding. I'm a white male with graying hair and glasses, wearing a blue suit and white shirt and blue tie, speaking to you from my office in the Fleming building. I want to take this opportunity also to thank Rob for his outstanding service. He will forever be U of M's first Chief Diversity Officer and an individual whose excellence in scholarship, advocacy, and passion for this university helped us achieve success in our strategic plan for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and keep us on a trajectory for greater accomplishments in the year ahead. The accomplishments of DEI 1.0 would not have been possible without his commitment to broad collaboration, his tremendous dedication to making U of M a better place for all, and his steadfast leadership that's inspired a university community of more than 100,000 individuals. I've very much appreciated his friendship and wise counsel over the years, and I'm thrilled that he's agreed to stay in the role as we conduct a search for our next Chief Diversity Officer before returning to our faculty. Thank you very much, Rob, both personally and on behalf of the institution, and a virtual round of applause. One of the goals of our strategic plans was to ensure that our highest values would permeate all aspects of our university, from our mission of academic excellence for the public good to the structures and processes that make our work possible. DEI at U of M extends through all parts of our campus, uniting thousands in our community in service of the idea that we cannot be excellent without being diverse, and that we must ensure our community allows all individuals an equal opportunity to thrive. Our DEI values are inseparable from our teaching and learning, our research and patient care, our budgeting and campus events, our hiring and our student recruitment. Thank you all who have made this possible through your ideas, advocacy, and commitment. As we reflect on what we've accomplished these past 5 years, we also recognize that our work is far from finished. As this summit's theme notes, the parallel pandemics of structural racism and COVID-19 have further exposed hate, divisions, inequality, and injustice in our society. Because while the COVID-19 pandemic is global, its human consequences have been unequal. Thanks to research and scholarship at the University of Michigan, we better understand the disproportionate harms of COVID-19 on Black and Latinx people, and the disease's intersections with poverty, segregation, and mental health. We know that gender inequities in the medical field were exacerbated by the pandemic, that too few healthcare workers know how to create a welcoming environment for non-binary and transgender patients, that police violence exceeds other forms of violence and its adverse impact on mental health in our communities, and that violence against Asian Americans has exploded in frequency and severity. We've also experienced the pain from these parallel pandemics acutely and personally. Our community is too often attacked by expressions of white supremacy, by xenophobia, anti-Semitism, bigotry, Islamophobia, and other forms of hate. Our strategic plan for DEI has helped us confront these challenges while also positioning us to ask bigger questions. Our community is engaged in a larger dialogue about inclusivity and racism. We're questioning not just policies and actions, but also the structural foundations of many institutions in society, including our own. As I noted in my leadership address, we're examining policies and procedures that unintentionally may have disparate impacts on groups of people, enacting changes to prevent sexual and gender-based misconduct, and transforming our culture to reflect the core beliefs of our community. To make our university a better place now and in the future, we must examine the racism and lack of inclusion that's been part of our past. This includes actions that were taken and structures that caused harm to groups in our community, and questioning notions of common sense that actually represent systemic inequity. Our work to shape DEI 2.0 will include these bigger questions, and we want to hear from you to help us be bolder and better. Our planning will include a census survey that will be open to all students, faculty, and staff on campus beginning in late October. This is similar to the survey we conducted 5 years ago. We'll also conduct a scientific sampling of our community. We want to know where we made progress and where we need to try new approaches. Please participate when the broader survey is launched, and if you're part of the sampling survey as well. We need to learn from your perspectives, opinions, and experiences. The challenges to diversity, equity, and inclusion have been centuries in the making, and they continue to persist today. But I have every confidence that they will not outlast our will. Diversity, equity, and inclusion will remain a major focus of my presidency and of this university long into the future. Your commitment to excellence, hard work, and resolve for justice are ensuring that. As we look forward together to shaping DEI 2.0, I'm reminded of a time in our university's past when a period of national upheaval was punctuated by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The act prohibited discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin, and was later the basis for similar protections for sexual orientation and gender identity. 5 months after it was signed into law, Thurgood Marshall delivered the commencement address in Hill Auditorium. He challenged graduates to become intellectually and personally involved in fulfilling the promise that the human rights of every individual shall be secured. He further said, "Today we stand on the threshold of an exciting and yet foreboding, an inviting and yet awesome phase in the endless struggle to fulfill the promise of civilization." Thanks to all of you, we will forever be a university that aspires to fulfill our promise. It's a promise that we make to ourselves as students, faculty, staff, alumni, and supporters. A promise we make to every child who seeks excellence in their education. And a promise we make to all of humanity as members of a public research university community. Our promise on this precipice of tomorrow is that our commitment to DEI will be as perpetual as our excellence, that these are inseparable values, will always be a defining quality of the University of Michigan. Thank you very much, and I'd now like to hand things over to Provost Susan Collins.
Thank you very much, President Schlissel. Much appreciated. And good morning, everybody. I would also like to express my thanks and congratulations to Byron Brooks for his very moving performance. I'm a Black woman with short, curly, salt and pepper hair, and I am wearing a black and white jacket today. It's both wonderful and important that we're gathered today to assess our community's progress towards diversity, equity, and inclusion. As you know, we and the larger society are dealing with parallel pandemics, structural racism, as well as the multiple impacts of the coronavirus. And of course, these have interrelated effects. As a global community and as a university community, we must work collaboratively with knowledge and imagination to address these challenges. Their interconnectedness has led us to intensify our work in understanding disparities in society and on campus, and to elevate and amplify the research and education about them. So today, together, we're focusing on our local community. In this 5th year of our diversity strategic planning process, we're beginning the analysis and the evaluation of the work that we've done across the university. And while a lot has been done, of course, there is much more going forward. This analysis and evaluation will provide us with valuable insights about what works and what doesn't, allowing us to determine effective ways to move forward. And it will also support sharing good practices and refinement of these practices so that they work in the many, many different settings that make up our large university. Rob Seller's thoughtful and inclusive leadership has been a critical part of this process. With deep concern for all in our community, with incredible energy, he's helped the many schools, departments, offices, and work families that comprise our university to examine how they work, formally and informally, and to identify and change what does not align with our values and our mission. He's focused on the development of programs and opportunities that involve students, prospective students, faculty, staff, and changes that have enriched scholarship and education both on our campus and far beyond. From this strong, broad foundation, we're poised to go forward, building on the evaluation that's underway over the next 12 months. And as a learning institution committed to using the knowledge we gain to inform necessary changes in our policies, procedures, and practices. Although eager to return to his faculty role, Rob has generously agreed to continue as Vice Provost for Equity and Inclusion and as Chief Diversity Officer until his successor is in place. His commitment to a smooth transition is a testament to his deep belief in this work and the university's role as a leader in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so it's really a pleasure for me personally and on behalf of the academic space of the university to thank Rob for his dedication to finding ways to overcome the racism that plagues our society, his work and his faith in our ability to do better as we work together. They make a real difference in our lives, in our community, and in the world. Rob, thank you very much. So in closing, let me thank all of you for continuing to do the very challenging and also rewarding work that we do together to achieve the goals that we set forward. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, President Schlissel and Provost Collins, and good morning to everyone joining us. My name is Berenice Alex Cabrera, and I'm a Latina woman with straight dark brown hair at about shoulder length, and I'm wearing a blue and green blouse. I'm a master's candidate in the School of Education and a member of the Student Advisory Planning Group for the DEI Summit Community Assembly. And today I have the distinct honor of introducing a soul-stirring performance by 3 students of the Black Leaders Art Collective. Maddie Levy, pursuing a Bachelor of Music in Oboe Performance, Chase Warren, pursuing a Bachelor of Music in Vocal Performance, and Aldo Bando Gerard, pursuing a Bachelor of Musical Arts and Voice and a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering, will all be performing an original composition of Strange Fruit, originally recorded by singer Billie Holiday in 1939. Please welcome Black Leaders Art Collective.
biduba, biduba, shu, biduba, biduba, shu, biduba, biduba, shu, biduba, shu, biduba, 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 biduba, Pastoral scene of and south, bulging eyes and twisted mouth, scent of magnolias, sweet and fresh. Then a sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is a fruit for cross to pluck. For the sun to rot, for the tree to drop. Here is a strange and bitter crop.
Hello, my name is Katrina Wade Golden, and I have the honor of serving as the Deputy Chief Diversity Officer here at the university. I'm an African-American woman with dark brown hair, and I'm wearing a Black dress with a bright, multicolored rose-themed necklace. Thank you to the Black Leaders Art Collective. I now have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker. Today's keynote speaker is an award-winning documentarian, journalist, speaker, author, and philanthropist. She is the CEO of Soledad O'Brien Productions, a multi-platform media production company dedicated to telling empowering and authentic stories on a range of social issues, and a thought leader whose public engagement garners wide attention. She currently anchors and produces the Hearst television magazine program, Matter of Fact, with Soledad O'Brien, and reports regularly for HBO's Real Sports with Brian Gumbel. In 2003, O'Brien joined CNN, where she was the face of CNN's morning news shows for many years and a frequent reporter and analyst for breaking news stories and election coverage. She also anchored the CNN documentary unit, where she created the In America documentary series, Black in America and Latino in America, which she continued to produce under Starfish Media Group as speaking tours. Upon funding Starfish Media Group, she continued to produce documentaries and series on topics that included youth incarceration, police brutality, veterans with PTSD, and the opioid epidemic. O'Brien recently hosted American Injustice, a BET town hall on the future of criminal justice reform. She was a Harvard University Graduate School of Education Distinguished Visiting Fellow. O'Brien frequently speaks on a variety of social issues at college campuses and corporate events. She is the author of 2 books, her critically acclaimed memoir, The Next Big Story, and Latino in America. Please give a warm Michigan welcome to Soledad O'Brien.
Thank you, and hi, everybody. Thank you so much. My name is Soledad O'Brien. My pronouns are she and her. I'm 5'5", brown hair, brown eyes. I'm a New Yorker, so I'm wearing all black. And now that I hear that out loud, it sounds kind of boring. Before I get into my talk, which is really going to focus on the intersection of the two crises that we're experiencing right now, which is structural racism and COVID-19, I'll tell you kind of a funny story. One day I ran into the other Soledad O'Brien. There is another Soledad O'Brien. I am Afro-Latina. This Soledad O'Brien is Puerto Rican. And one day we bumped into each other in Rockefeller Center. She said, "Are you Soledad O'Brien?" I had never met her before. I said, "Yes." And I literally went to grab a pen to give her an autograph. And she said, "I hate you. You have ruined my life. I can't get a credit card. I can't rent an apartment." She too was 5'5", brown hair, brown eyes. And so we ended up being friends after that. But it was an awkward few minutes. I started working in TV news in 1987. I loved telling stories. I was pretty good at it, although my first job was really removing staples from all 3 floors of WBZ TV. My parents, who'd spent a bunch of money on my education, were a little dismayed by that. But I loved being part of a team whose ultimate goal was to tell stories. And you pretty quickly could figure out where the power lay. You know, people often think it's with the anchor team, and it's not. The power is actually in the hands of people who will decide what narratives are told, who gets the time, who's left out altogether, what stories are elevated, and who decides who gets 1 minute and who gets 30 minutes. I mean, you can see it every day on the news today. When I started back in 1987, I was kind of a woefully underpaid low-level assistant. And I never realized that I'd have the opportunity to report on some of the most important stories of our time: Hurricane Katrina, the tsunami in Japan, the Haiti earthquake, and also be part of a documentary series and the unit that, as you heard, I helped create, looking at Black in America, Latino in America, Muslim in America, gay in America. I did not name them. I would have been more creative, but that is what they were called. When I started, I was just really trying to figure out the gig. And over time, I was able to, in local news, by the time I moved to San Francisco, get a little bit better at the skills, but not really understand when we talk about structural racism and even just structures, the structures that exist that help connect the dots to what we experience today and what happened in the past. And I'll give you an example. In local news, when I worked in San Francisco, this was in the early 1990s, I would cover a mambo snake was on the loose in San Francisco. And we covered that with a breathless, "Oh my goodness, stay in your homes. There's a snake loose." I would go to the fish market and talk about the fish market being open, and you can never get the smell of when you're holding fish out of your clothes. I actually went to, in Oakland, where I was the bureau chief. I reported on a guy who believed that his cat was his roommate reincarnated. I kid you not. That was my story. My husband, by the way, refers to this entire period as not my best work. But mostly the stories that I was reporting, and I won't blame anybody else, the stories that I was reporting lacked context. They lacked an understanding of the structures that exist and have existed a long time in America. So for example, one Christmas day, I was new, so I was the lowest level reporter. I was working on Christmas. We were telling the story of a little boy who had shot his sister. And we had all kind of camped out on the lawn of the mom. They'd already created the graphic. We call that an animated graphic. It has music and it kind of rolls. And I remember the mom came out and said, "Could you all please leave?" And I was almost baffled, like, leave? We've got an 11 o'clock live shot and a noon live shot, and I've got hits at 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and we're going to do the whole first half hour at 5. And I remember, I look back now and I'm so ashamed because a lot of the way we thought about how we covered stories didn't think about systems and how they work, right? Poor people were poor. Mothers who killed their children in San Francisco and nationally, when I was working as a reporter, we had a handful of those. They were just crazy. We didn't dive into context and nuance. And I look back now and I'm just ashamed of how I mean, it was typical, but I don't think that excuses anything. And I don't think it was until I started reporting on Hurricane Katrina that I began to understand systems at work, when you would realize that if you thought of Katrina as a storm, you were really missing the boat, right? That there were these systems that led us all to be where we were at a certain time. And for me to witness as a reporter the complete and utter failure of people to help people who needed the most, I guess it gave me a sense of urgency and understanding about how we have to think about stories, especially when they come to involve race and something that's unfolding in a current day. So for example, structural racism and COVID-19 today. I knew at some point I'd start covering race because of the way I grew up. My mom and dad met in the United States. My mom was Afro-Cuban. My dad was white and Australian. He passed away. They both passed away a couple of years ago. And they used to tell the story of how they met. They met because they both went to daily mass. So the entire point of this story will be about daily mass. You should go to daily mass. But they met because my dad had a car and he would drive and he would basically hit on my mom as she was walking to mass. Can't clean that up. That's what happened. Every day he'd wind down the window on his way to daily mass and ask her for a ride. And she would say, well, no, thank you. No, thank you. And then one day she said, yes, I'll take a ride. And they made a date to go on a date. But every restaurant, of course, this was Baltimore in 1958, would not serve them because interracial dating, as my mom would say, was frowned upon. I said, well, what does that mean? She said, well, you could get shot. Eventually, my mom took my dad back to her apartment. She whipped him up an amazing meal of Cuban food. My mother was a fantastic cook. And the entire point of her telling the story to me and my 5 brothers and sisters was not about integration or segregation or even injustice. Literally, for my mom, it was, girls, if you can cook, you could get a man, because she felt that was a good thing to go into the world. And I'd like to say, I can't make it, but I can make it happen as I pick up the phone and order in. When my parents decided that they would get married at the end of 1958, interracial marriage was illegal in the state they lived in. And so they drove to DC and got hitched, and then they drove back to Baltimore and lived illegally as a married couple. And I used to ask my mom, so what was that like? My brother, my 2 older siblings were born in Baltimore at that time, 1960, 1961. And she said, we would walk down the street as a family and people would spit on us. I was like, oh my goodness, what did you do? And she said this thing that I think really shaped for me how I thought about journalism and reporting generally. She said, Lovey, she used to call me Lovey, we knew America was better than that. And what I loved about that, right, was this idea that you had to opt in to change. And so when I hear the university president talk about ways in which we have to move forward, you have to opt in to making change. If you sit and wait for things to happen, it just won't happen. It won't happen without good people deciding they're going to make change. We are currently living, as we all know, through 2 crises, right? One that's new, COVID-19, or newish now, and then the other that's as old as our nation itself. COVID-19 and a virus, has claimed the lives of more Americans than any war in U.S. history, now including the American Civil War. And COVID-19 is living aside a more persistent sickness, which is a world of racial inequality. And I think that continues to threaten all of us, not just people of color. Certainly injustice preceded the pandemic, but COVID-19 has unveiled this injustice that maybe even the most enlightened of us would not have actually imagined. And I think that combating these twin plagues in a way is going to require that we persist in building spaces of normalcy in the middle of what is profoundly abnormal. I think it's impossible to overestimate the impact that COVID-19 has had on communities of color and their access to higher education and many other things. Students who've been forced to abandon their education certainly can't easily make up for that loss. We know that Black and Hispanic students in the US are less likely than white students and white adults overall to say that they own a computer. We know that there's big risks for a post-COVID inequities when we look at budget cuts and closures. And we understand that this phenomenon is not just an American phenomenon, right? This is a global issue. Learning has been disrupted for 1.5 billion children and young people by coronavirus around the world. That's according to the World Bank. So how do we think about addressing structural racism in the age of coronavirus, in an age where the impact of structural racism has now been made worse by this new crisis? The CDC and many others have noted that centuries of racism in this country have had a profoundly negative impact. It's pervasive, it's deeply embedded in American society, even as some would like to say it's not. It affects a vast range of socioeconomic benefits, housing, education, wealth, employment, the list goes on and on and on. And those conditions are key drivers of the health inequities within communities of color. Black and brown communities, we know, experience higher rates of illness and death across a wide range of health conditions. And you know them, right? You know, diabetes, hypertension, obesity, asthma, heart disease, all compared to white counterparts. The COVID-19 pandemic then takes deadly advantage of these enduring health disparities. And we also know the disparate impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on African Americans. African Americans make up 13% of the US population, 33% of patients that have been admitted to the hospital with COVID-19. Black men, 6 times more likely to die than white men. Black women, 4 times more likely to die of COVID-19 than white women. Black undergraduate enrollment down compared to their white counterparts. The list goes on and on. And the CDC also notes that Black populations are disproportionately represented among essential workers and industries which might be contributing to those COVID-19 and health disparities. You look at who are those essential workers, and we know that often that over-indexes in African Americans and people of color generally. We know that people of color, Black people specifically, lack access many times, done a lot of stories on this, to clinics and hospitals and other sources of public health that other communities are just accustomed to. And the Lancet found, and I think we all know this, they suggest that the ethnic and racial disparities in COVID-19 might be part of the fact that minority groups receive less evaluation and testing often, or less access to treatment, or it comes later in the disease process. So missing all these opportunities for early interventions that could have saved lives. Counties with higher proportions of Black residents had more COVID-19 diagnoses and deaths, even after adjusting for certain characteristics like age and poverty and comorbidities and the duration of the epidemic. COVID-19 deaths were higher in disproportionately Black rural and small metro counties. And also, not surprisingly, we have seen time and time again where there are political actors who are very willing to take advantage of COVID-19 for a very different political agenda. I'll give you an example. The state of Alabama, which got about $2.2 billion in funding, federal funding, aimed at alleviating the pandemic within its borders. But because states have a very wide berth at how they can spend that money, in Alabama, they've decided, even where they're still struggling mightily with their COVID rates, the lawmakers have decided that they're going to spend about 25% of that money to build some new prisons, right? So you can see where some of these challenges come together. So I think altogether, these challenges threaten to take back some of the progress that has already been made. And so when I talk about hope and when I talk about apertures of hope, you might say, well, what are you speaking about? Listen, I think COVID has unveiled problems that have festered kind of under the rug, if you will, for a long time. And our desire to disrupt and dismantle some of these issues, and by the way, that's just coincidentally a documentary series that we produced in the middle of the pandemic. That desire, we are, I believe, seeing grow in society at large. And I think in lots of ways, people are describing the killing of George Floyd as, quote, waking people up. When you go to protest marches and you'd say to people, well, why are you here? Have you protested before? They would say, I was home on lockdown in the pandemic, but this woke me up. All these other issues, this seemed to be the thing that took people, in some cases, over the top. Was it that we were on lockdown? Was that the main reason? Consuming media, not distracted, if that's the right word, by work or travel? Was it because the weather was warmer and that meant people wanted to be outside? Was it because, as one protester told me, the killing was just gruesome? And this was an interesting phrase. This was a young white woman, obviously hateful And to her, it served as a catalyst to bring attention that I think many African Americans had seen and known about in their communities for a long time. I mean, I've done a handful of documentaries on police misconduct, injustice, brutality, just unfairness. And yet she said it was a catalyst to bring attention because, maybe it came on the heels of some other massive failures in law enforcement. Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. Some described it as the last straw. Maybe it was the confluence of all of these events kind of intersecting with COVID-19 when the pandemic was forcing all of us to rethink what we thought of as normal. Can we reimagine a different structure? Can we think outside of the box of what could be better? Why did it take 9 minutes of someone being killed on video for people to begin to wrap their heads around what many people have known and what many examples have preceded the killing of George Floyd? There was a poll that ABC News did, and it suggested that 74% of Americans felt that the killing of Mr. Floyd was part of a broader problem in the treatment of African Americans by police. This was a sharp rise. And the only thing I find interesting in that number, 74%, is that it's such a sharp rise from 2014's poll, which followed the deaths of Michael Brown and Eric Garner. 43% of Americans felt those incidents reflected a broader problem. So suddenly there's this leap in polling in America, but that George Floyd was indicative of something being horribly, horribly wrong. Some argue that the killing of George Floyd gave people who are often uncomfortable talking about race at all a vocabulary. Again, the gruesome and obviously hateful, I thought, were such interesting words to use. And it gave them a point of reference for engaging in what is actually a complex and complicated discussion about race in America. Listen, ultimately, I think we as a nation can't let COVID-19 lessen our commitment to diversity because it could easily. It's challenging to navigate two parallel pandemics, two parallel crises at one time. But I think we all need to ensure that plans, whether they're strategic plans for a university or they're just individual plans or community plans, are constantly evaluated and really taking account the impact of the disease itself and also how we are understanding this conversation about race and opportunity and lack of opportunity in America today. Listen, communities around our country have realized very quickly that COVID-19 has blown up this idea of like, this is how we do it. This is how we work, right? Whatever we thought this day has now changed dramatically. How we want to live, what we value, what we want things to look like. We understand that if action isn't taken, if we don't confront injustice and structural racism and disparities that have made the pandemic so deadly to so many, well, we're not going to survive as a whole. The intersection of COVID-19 and the devastating cost of structural racism has caused that. We have an opportunity, I think, to make change and bring change and commit to making change. As President Schlissel says, he talks about a commitment to change. And I think assessing progress, as you're doing today, is essential. And holding ourselves accountable is essential. And whether you're a university or you're an individual or you run a small business or you run a small town or you run a big city, holding ourselves accountable is critical. And then, of course, I think continuing to collaborate to move forward is going to be really ultimately what helps bring real change. This is a very crucial time. We can head the right direction or we can fall back. As my mom said, listen, you have to opt in to making change. And I think this is an excellent opportunity to opt in to bringing the change that we know can happen. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Soledad, for that reflective and inspiring message. Now I'd like to introduce the panelists for our roundtable discussion. First, I'd like to introduce the moderator of our panel, Dr. Rihanna Elise Anderson, Assistant Professor of Health, Behavior, and Health Education at the School of Public Health. I'd like to welcome Soledad back to our panel. Welcome Sydney Carr, President of Students of Color of Rackham and doctoral candidate in the College of Literature, Science, and Arts and the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy. Welcome to Jeff Witt, an Organizational Development Lead and DEI Lead at U of M Library. Welcome Dr. Ulu Wafermi Okenlami, Student Accessibility and Accommodation Services, Assistant Professor in Michigan Medicine. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to welcome our featured external panelist, Valerie Kaur. Valerie is a renowned civil rights leader, lawyer, best-selling author, award-winning filmmaker, educator, innovator, and celebrated prophetic voice. She leads the Revolutionary Love Project to reclaim love as a force for justice. Valerie burst into America's consciousness in the wake of the 2016 election when her Watch Night service address went viral with 40 million views worldwide. Valerie has been a regular TV commentator on MSNBC and contributor to CNN, NPR, PBS, The Hill, Huffington Post, and The Washington Post. A daughter of Sikh farmers in California's heartland, Valerie earned degrees at Stanford University, Harvard Divinity School, and Yale Law School. Valerie's debut book, See No Stranger, a memoir and manifesto of revolutionary love, was released in 2020 and expands on her blockbuster TED Talk. Welcome to all the panelists.
Thank you so much, Katrina. Again, I'm Dr. Rihanna Elise Anderson. I'm a biracial light-skinned woman with short hair, pink lipstick, gold hoop earrings, and Soledad, you're not the only one who can wear a black dress. Just because I'm from Detroit does not mean we don't wear black up in here. So I'm actually sitting in Detroit. I have a Detroit background. I'm at the University of Michigan Detroit Center. I'm so grateful that you did invoke the mental and public health elements within your keynote. So thank you so much for that. And I welcome you all. I'm so excited to dig into our conversation today. Valerie, we're actually going to kick it off with you. So as our featured panelist, I want to think about your activism, which is tightly connected to revolution and love. So why do you think it took a global pandemic and the public murder of George Floyd to start this conversation and examination of structural racism in America? And how does revolutionary love aid in its resolution?
Oh, well, let me say first, I'm so honored to be here with you all this morning. Thank you so much, Soledad. Thank you to the University of Michigan. Congratulations on 5 years of incredible work. I am a South Asian American woman with long black hair wearing a blue blouse, and I'm speaking to you from my home in Los Angeles, ancestral land of the Tongva peoples. In the wake of George Floyd's murder, many Black leaders I work with experienced despair, but not shock. There was a sense that nothing had changed, that George Floyd's murder felt like the way they felt after Mike Brown or Tamir Rice, or for those who've been in LA for a while, it felt like 1992 after the meeting of Rodney King. And for our elders, it felt like 1968. Why is it that every turn through the cycle feels like the previous trauma? This conversation around structural racism and police brutality and anti-Blackness in America is as old as the country itself, for as long as people of color, Black people in particular, have been trying to get the nation to pay attention. So the awakening happened not among Black activists or Black communities necessarily. The awakening happened for the rest of us who simply realized that we could no longer turn away. Because what happened after George Floyd's murder is that we suddenly saw these images of Black people kneeling in the street, surrounded by a wall of white people in front of an army of police officers. Those images we haven't seen before. And so Black leaders were turning to me with a sense of awe that, okay, because of the groundwork that we have put in place, because of generations of struggle and calling attention, now we were prepared for those who were awake enough to join in on a multiracial, multi-faith global uprising for Black lives. That's new. And that was happening at the same time as an awakening around the disproportionate impact of how this virus is killing people of color more than any other group. This, of course, again, was not new for Black people who saw Katrina, as Soledad reported. We've seen how public health crises, climate catastrophes have impacted people of color disproportionately, but there was a sense of not being able to look away anymore. And I think that that awakening is an opportunity for us to follow the lead of people of color who've been in the struggle for a very, very long time. When Soledad was invoking her mother's wisdom, America is better than that. It made me think of my own parents and their faith in America. And, my grandfather came to California in 1913. So my family has been part of the American story for 100 years. And I always had this notion of linear progress in my mind, that we were just getting to become a nation that was more safe and more free. And then, when my children were born, coming to terms with the fact that I was raising them in a nation more dangerous for them as little brown children than it was for me, or even for my grandparents when they arrived. What is progress in America if it feels like we're sliding backwards? And so I want to offer a question that has been the question that keeps me going every day. And this is to answer your question around why love. The future feels dark, but what if this darkness is not the darkness of the tomb, but the darkness of the womb? What if our America is not dead, but a nation still waiting to be born? What if all of our ancestors who struggled, who fought colonization, slavery, segregation, what if they are whispering in our ear now, you are brave? What if this is our nation's great transition? Progress in birthing labor is cyclical, not linear. It's a series of expansions and contractions. And so yes, every turn through the cycle feels like the previous trauma, but every time more and more people are awake and committed to show up to the labor, it creates more space for solidarity and equality and dignity than there was before. And that's what gives me hope, that if people are showing up with this ethic of love, this revolutionary love, to see others as sisters and brothers in the struggle alongside us, then I don't know how many more turns through the cycle it's going to take before we birth in America where we are all safe and free. But I know I want to show up to do my part in the labor. And the way that I show up with longevity, with resilience, with even joy, is if I'm showing up with my siblings, is if I'm showing up with love.
Valerie, that was absolutely beautiful, and I'm very inspired. So thank you so much for those fantastic words. Soledad, bringing you back into this conversation. So Valerie indicated in her statement of who she was, and you've mentioned in your statement, I mentioned in my statement, that we come from this multiracial and diverse perspective. And we know that dangerous rhetoric from the former president and a false categorization of COVID-19 as the, quote, China virus has caused a rise in anti-Asian hate and acts of violence in the Asian community, against. What parallels can be drawn from the Asian experience with racism to the racism experienced by Black Americans and Latino Americans? And how might that be a unifier of these communities in the fight to dismantle structural racism?
It's such a great question, and I'm going to answer it as a documentarian, because ultimately where they are similar is in these narratives have just been excluded. Years ago, when we started doing our Black in America documentary series, it would go on to be one of the highest rated series on CNN at the time, but it was made very clear to me, I think the phrase was, so don't make it too Black, right? Because it was called Black in America, but everyone understood the assignment, which was don't lose the white audience. Don't make anybody uncomfortable. Make sure, like, we've got these people we value. We've got to do this thing over here. Don't mess up the thing we value. At the end of the day, that documentary series would go on to grow our Black audience tremendously, but it grew our white audience more. And that was because I think people were very interested in stories that just hadn't been elevated, that they just had never really been, served before. The media had kind of failed. And I think in a lot of ways for the Asian American community, when I proposed doing Asian in America, right, the idea was, well, we just don't have a big enough viewership that's Asian, right? Those stories don't matter because, here's who our demographic is, as if we only want to see the stories that are exactly demographically about ourselves. I mean, it's so absurd. It's almost silly to say out loud, because I think people think, well, think of all the stories that you love that have nothing to do with your own experiences. But I think Asian Americans have had a very similar experience. Your narrative is just not known. It's irrelevant. It doesn't matter. I think as we started hearing more and more about Asian American violence, people started looking into the history. I mean, the Chinese Exclusion Act kind of lays out exactly what it was about, right? The Chinese exclusion. It's not subtle. And I think it's allowed some media organizations to take the opportunity to elevate some of the history that just was not known, some of the way past history, and also some of the current history as well, connecting the dots. And so, in a way, I think that's how they're very much the same. There's this opportunity for people whose narratives are considered, well, kind of over there. There's us here, and we're going to tell the stories. And then is it Black History Month? Oh, we'll do that. Oh, is it Hispanic History Month? Let's go tap that. But for the most part, they're not woven into the fabric of, actually, we're a nation. Everybody's story is interesting and it matters. And you're going to find that lots of people are interested in the stories that aren't about specifically their own people, their own families. I personally know I am. And it's a unifier because of that. I think we are seeing people demand more time for those stories, more connection to those stories, more connecting of the dots. Why is this happening? Even more deconstructing, so who's perpetrating this violence and why? What are the sub-stories around the stories that we're seeing? I think the worst thing that the media can do is to not connect the dots, to just plunk a fact out there without giving context and explaining. And if you ever follow me on Twitter, I lose my mind telling people, like, this is not contextual. This requires you to explain history or what happened before, or what's going to happen next, or who said this. And I think there is this opportunity for people to recognize that we all have these tremendous stories and they contribute to the fabric of America. And we deserve the chance to tell those stories. We should demand the opportunities to tell those stories. Listen, I love Black History Month, but I want all my stories all the time. And I think, and I don't want the stories about women in Women's History Month. I want people to feel like they understand the importance of the American journey, which sometimes is pretty awful, sometimes is really challenging, is kind of terrible for a lot of people a lot of the time. But I think those are true narratives and they deserve to be told. So I think in that respect, there's an opportunity here for it to be a unifier around what we expect in terms of the American narrative.
Thank you so much for that, Soledad. As someone who went to the preview of your Black in America special in DC many moons ago, it was something that, to your point, brought attention to this issue on CNN and has now continued to show for not only Black communities, but Latina as well. And hopefully they listen to you for the Asian special as well, so that we can show that spotlight for that interconnectedness of our community. So thank you so much for that. Sydney, I'd love to bring you in here. As the president of SCORE, you've certainly had a range of vantage points over the past 19 months. And so we know that racism has been a reality of America long before the murder of George Floyd, as folks have said, and COVID-19. But because these two things intersected, a lot of folks were awakened to the realities of racism that they were able to ignore in the past. Is this truly the beginning of meaningful change? And if so, what do you believe our next steps should be on this journey to dismantling structural racism?
Yes, and thank you so much for this really thoughtful and provocative question, Rihanna. And I also just want to thank all the other panelists. I'm super honored to be sharing this space with you all today. And also, as a description, I'm a young Black woman in my mid-20s. I'm wearing a blue pinstripe shirt and I have long Black hair. I'll also just start by saying there's really no correct way to answer this question, right? It's super layered, super complex. It's something that we've been talking about even before George Floyd, right? But I'm going to try my best to really speak to that today. And so first, it's important that we recognize that racism has been a reality in this country long before the murder of George Floyd last summer 2020. And so, but it seemed as though people started to quote unquote wake up, right? And so I've been grappling with that question a lot, right? Like, why did it seem like the first time, almost in a way, that a Black person gets murdered, and all of a sudden people seem more attentive to that in ways that we really haven't seen before, right? I'm sure a lot of us have gotten, texts or emails, right, from non-Black folks, right, expressing, just their solidarity with us, right, or their allyship, right. And so I thought that was really, really interesting. It seemed like people started to take action in ways that we hadn't seen before. It seemed like they started to protest, particularly from non-Black and Brown people. But as a caveat to that, I think it's also important that we can't let it stop there, right? The emails, the statements of solidarity, right? Those things were great. But I think the real change begins when each of us recognize the fact that we have a real issue in this country, right? And that issue is rooted in systemic racism. It's rooted in the historical legacy of slavery. And so when we first start grappling with those truths and recognizing our real issue and the deep problem, I think only then we can begin to start this process of change. And I think so, like educating, people starting to educate themselves on what that really means in those truths is important first and foremost, right? But it's also important that Black people, Black and Brown people don't have to be the ones to do this work, right? We shouldn't have to educate, others on our experiences. They should go out and do that themselves, right? And it's hard to say whether structural racism will ever truly be dismantled. I think something else that we also have to look forward to or look toward are our institutions, right? Our colleges and universities, places and institutions with power, with money, right? Because we know that this structural racism problem, it's a systemic problem, right? And so only can you start to dismantle that by starting at the top, right? And so, for example, I'm a doctoral candidate. I'm here at the University of Michigan, and I do a lot of work with students of color, Rackham, really advocating on behalf of graduate students of color here at the University of Michigan to make sure that they feel protected, right? To make sure that they feel like the university is looking out for them because, getting a PhD it's a very hard experience. It's a very long journey, right? And being a marginalized student only adds on top of that, those other stressors, right? And so students in these universities, they should feel safe. They should feel like their university will protect them at all costs. For example, if students feel unsafe following a particularly racialized incident, let's make sure that we're holding those responsible truly accountable, right? Like, let's make sure that it's extending beyond those statements of solidarity, right? Let's make sure that we let our students know, particularly our marginalized and our underrepresented students know, yes, we are going to do everything to protect you at all costs because we value you, right? We value your presence in our university. And I think it's also important that we give underrepresented and marginalized groups a voice, right? And a quote unquote seat at the table. And so something that I also think about is, let's make sure that we're, aligning our words with actions. Let's make sure that we're continuing to admit more Black and Brown students into graduate degree programs, right? Let's make sure that we are not only hiring more Black and Brown faculty, but also simultaneously awarding those tenure, right? And I think that's super, super, super important. I think, like I said, when I started speaking, this is a multi-layered, multi-dimensional question. It's hard, it's complex. Who knows if this will ever be dismantled, but I think that we can start, right? And I think that we can start by truly, like I said, aligning those words with action. So.
Thank you so much, future Dr. Carr. One place that I know that we're going to make that change is through you. You have talked about several layers. You've talked about the university, and one other space there is in our scholarships. So I'd be remiss if I didn't take a moderator's point of privilege here just to note a work we just published that distinguished racism as endemic to America relative to the emergent COVID pandemic. So we keep calling it twin or parallel pandemics. And one thing that we noted is that language is so important that it is endemic, it's entrenched, it is part and parcel to the racial dynamics of our, COVID is part and parcel to those racial dynamics. It's not that they're occurring simultaneously, it's really that one birthed the other, as was indicated a few times today. So I look forward to having some scholarship with you, Dr. Carr, so that we're a future Dr. Carr, so that we can tackle this huge problem on our campus. Let's turn to you, Dr. Okunlami. I'm really excited to talk with you today as the Director of Student Accessibility and Accommodation Services. I know that you think critically about equity, and we know that many of the most vulnerable, such as those within our BIPOC communities, were more severely impacted by the effects of COVID. We rarely talk, however, about the impact of the disabled community. Are you able to talk about how this community has been impacted, what is unique, and how in some instances this has intersected with racism? Dr. O, to you.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. This is Dr. O speaking. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm a young-ish cisgender Black man with short Black hair and a Black goatee. I have on dark-rimmed glasses, a white collared shirt with a wooden bow tie and a blue vest. I'm seated in my manual wheelchair in my office in Haven Hall with a blank whiteboard, some diplomas, an American flag, and a block M on a wooden bookshelf in my background. So, as the head of disability services and as a disabled Black male physician, I've experienced this pandemic or these pandemics from several different vantage points. And Soledad earlier talked about how minority groups were getting less access to testing and treatment, about how COVID-related deaths were disproportionately higher in BIPOC communities. But the disability community, however, especially given how diverse we are, and we're not always recognized as a distinct community. But what must be mentioned is the fact that while the entire world was struggling with access to COVID testing at first, access to then vaccinations, access to medical care, access to remote learning and remote work, the disability community often felt like an afterthought. Whether it was physical accessibility of those COVID testing and vaccination sites, whether it was providing accurate captions and ASL interpreters for the countless Zoom calls that have now become the primary means of communication, or providing adequate disability-related educational accommodations for our students with disabilities. Creating that necessary access for people with disabilities was almost never a consideration up front, but only after individuals spoke up after not having the access that they deserved. Now, as for how that may intersect, some of you may remember the name of Dr. Susan Moore. She was a Black woman, a physician, and a University of Michigan Medical School alumna who died due to complications from COVID-19 last year. In the days preceding her passing, she was very vocal about how she felt her race contributed to the inadequate treatment of her pain and a lack of respect by the medical team that was caring for her. But many of you may not know the name of Michael Hickson, a 46-year-old Black man with quadriplegia who also died last year after contracting COVID-19. And his family believes that potentially life-saving treatment was withheld due to the belief that his life had less value. Now, Dr. Lisa Iazzoni actually published an article recently that showed that physicians believe that people with disabilities have a worse quality of life compared to individuals without disability. Now, while the impact of that study may not be immediately apparent, this just underscores the ableist beliefs that exist within medicine and in society that in general devalue disabled body minds. So when you add racism and ableism to COVID-19, you only exponentially exacerbate the discrimination and marginalization that is worsening already existing healthcare disparities and the impact that these have on our BIPOC and disabled communities. I often say to people that the past may not be your fault, but the future will be. And I love Valerie's labor analogy, especially as a physician, and describing it as cyclical. Because even though we are now 31 years after the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the fight to dismantle ableism also requires us to stay woke, as Byron said earlier, and recognize the opportunity to make our tomorrow better than our yesterday. Soledad talked about the stories that aren't being told and connecting dots, and disability is ubiquitous. It does not discriminate based on race or gender or ethnicity or any other demographic factor, and it is a group that any of us could join at any time, and that many more people identify with than the 20% that we often cite. So that is where the intersection of this disability community then parallels these pandemics of racism, ableism, sexism, and all other factors of prejudice and discrimination. And when we connect the dots and recognize that we are all much more similar than we are different, we no longer look to then provide sort of only support for the communities that we identify with, but we see that this fight to dismantle these systemic structures is going to then be that rising tide that raises all of our boats, because every single one of our communities is drowning right now.
Y'all better come through with these metaphors and analogies. I'm just really blown away. These are some amazing stick to them points. So I'm so grateful for those words, Dr. O. And I think you're echoing what we've heard from Soledad and Valerie and so many others, in that we have this ability and this moment right now to engage with so many communities in shared hurt, shared frustration. And I know for myself, when I saw some of those racial disparities that started last year, and I saw the fracturing, people starting to say, oh, well, I don't care as much, I was really baffled that we didn't use that as a unifying time. And so I just want to harken back to your point. I think it's such an important one. Jeff, I want to make sure that we bring you in, and then we'll have a bit of time to chat as an entire panel, which I'm super excited about. So Jeff, you sit at this really interesting intersection of DEI and history as staff within the library. And we know that the murder of George Floyd reminded us, for some, of the brutal murder of Emmett Till, and that many saw Emmett's death as the catalyst for this civil rights movement. Are we experiencing a new civil rights movement now? And how is it different from the movement of the 60s?
Thanks, Dr. Anderson. It's certainly good to be here. And I do want to take just a few seconds to express my gratitude and thankfulness for being on a panel with such esteemed panelists. And I'm so grateful to share this space. So thank you for the question, and thank you for including me here. I would say that my thought, and before I do that, I do need to say that I use he and him pronouns, and I am a middle-aged white man, and I have short brown hair, and today I'm wearing a button-up purple shirt with clear-rimmed reading glasses on today. And in answer to your question, Dr. Anderson, I first want to reflect that my thoughts really echo and build on things that Sydney and Valerie and others on the panel have already talked about, and kind of comparing the journey of the civil rights movement and where that journey has been and where that journey is taking us as a society today and in the future. And my hope is that those of us who carry white privilege in this society are experiencing today's struggle to end systemic racism as a continued effort, that it's a journey toward anti-racism, and that it's a movement and not a series of moments in time. I also would want to point out how important it is for us to remember and celebrate those who have come before us that have struggled with this and fought this battle of social justice and civil rights before we entered the scene, and how we stand on the shoulders of the work that they've done. I would acknowledge that, of course, there are certainly differences between the fight for justice now compared to the 60s. And speaking from the perspective of a white cisgender man, I see that the groups of people who are gathering to fight for justice today are far more racially diverse than they were 55 years ago. And I'm really encouraged by that. And I hope that white allies in the movement stay in the movement to and continue to be an active part of the movement and not fade away or not become just a blip on the radar of this continued journey toward anti-racism. And more than that, I hope that we as white allies can learn to move beyond just allyship and continue to learn and to listen and to humble ourselves and lean into being in solidarity with our BIPOC colleagues and family and friends and neighbors. And as Sydney pointed out just a few minutes ago, how important it is for white allies to stand in solidarity and to do the work ourselves and to learn to do the work ourselves and to take responsibility for how we show up in these spaces. I also recognize that one thing that remains the same about the civil rights movement in the 60s and today is the covert, the overt, the sinister and the violent resistance that we receive from white supremacy. The false narratives that white supremacy continues to make the civil rights movement a necessity as much today as it did in the 60s or 55 years ago. In the 50s and 60s, the false narrative of white supremacy tried to make Jim Crow seem acceptable or even needed. Today, the false narratives of white supremacy continue to generate deplorable falsehoods that give racists the cover that they need to commit deplorable acts. It's the false narrative that we live in a post-racial society and that there's a level playing field, when we all know clearly that's not true. So I do believe that the civil rights movement continues, but some of the strategies and certainly some of the allies are new as we face new and additional false narratives that are still based on white supremacy.
Thanks so much for that, Jeff. In just our remaining moments, I want to take a bit of what you're saying and open it up to our panelists in that you talked about movements not just being made up of moments, that it's taking time, it's a process. But Soledad, when we started talking earlier today, you indicated a story about young girls in Tennessee who were disrespected this weekend by the police. So I'm thinking in particular, you've got these galvanizing forces who are starting to think about and make motion and process and get through where they need to be to get over white privilege, to turn down white supremacy. But then you have real people, little girls, young men, you have people who are being impacted daily, who can't wait, frankly, for some people to come into this awareness. So I'm wondering if there are things that we could do to have a stopgap or some remediation now that are going to allow for folks to get their lives together on the one hand, but to stop this real hurt and injustice for communities on the other.
It's such a tough question, I find, because sometimes I think one of the ways in which we learn, George Floyd is a great example, and there are so many others, right? We learn when something terrible happens, and then we all get together. And if we're lucky, there's progress out of it. Sometimes we have an opportunity to learn, and we as a country don't really take that opportunity. That story in Tennessee, you should check it out. It's on ProPublica. It takes place in 2016, but it's an investigation that was published over the weekend about 4 little girls. The oldest was 12, the youngest was 8, who were arrested, put in cuffs by the police. And the story of just the chaos and the adults who failed them as they were literally jailed. Their crime, which is not a crime, by the way, was being bystanders as some little boys. I think they were 5 and 6-year-olds were fighting and not stepping in. I can't even articulate how insane the story is. So I'm going to push everybody to go take a look at it. But I think you're exactly right. And one of the things that gives me a great hope is this concept of it's not linear progress, right? So it should be something terrible happens. We see it, we understand it, we all move forward in a better way. I think that's naive. I think, and I think this pandemic has actually contributed to the moment where the George Floyd killing just had a bigger impact. I'm not sure if we were not all stuck at home, if we were not all on social media 24/7, right? If we did not all, were in a very heightened emotional state, honestly am not sure that the George Floyd killing would have been so impactful, not for the people, Black people who saw it and felt like, oh gosh, I'm not even sure I can get out of bed today. But for other people who those things cross, I mean, I call them cross the wires all the time, and they don't stick. So I don't know that we're going to see tremendous growth and fixing of something in the short term while saving people from being in these terrible circumstances. I just don't know that that's possible, to be honest.
Thank you, Soledad. Valerie, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'm really thinking about the students who are listening. Because I remember when I was in college, the messages I would get were like, you know, it's your chance, it's your job to go out and save the world. And without anyone really saying in a sober way, in the way that I'm hearing Soledad invite us to say, is the labor is long and the labor is hard. And there are no quick fixes. And instead, we're looking at generational transformation. And the crises that we're facing, and we're talking about the pandemic and we're talking about racism, but I would add a third crisis, and that's the climate catastrophe. So between the racial reckonings and the public health crises and the climate catastrophes, these are all three converging to create an era of great instability, of great threat, and it will be the world that you will enter and struggle in and live in and raise your children in and find meaning in for the next 20, 30, 40 years. And so my invitation to you is to think about the labor for justice, not just as a means to an end, but as an end in itself. What if laboring for a more just and more beautiful world with resilience, with longevity, with your sisters, brothers, siblings at your side, with even joy, what if that itself is the meaning of life? What if you could measure your life not based on outcomes alone, but on your faithfulness to that labor? That is what I have come to. And that is why my work, for the last 20 years, I have organized around hate. I was 20 when 9/11 happened and hate violence erupted on city streets across the country. A family friend, Balbir Singh Sodhi, was a Sikh father who was the first person killed. There were no Stop Asian Hate hashtags back then. We were barely trying to get the nation's attention that we were being killed. And so for 20 years to see that violence not abating, that our communities are 5 times as likely to be targets of hate than we were before 9/11. It's been very difficult to attach myself to outcomes, but it's only learning the hard way that I realized, like, oh, the midwife has a wisdom in how to sustain longevity in any long labor. She doesn't say push, 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 my love. She says breathe, my love, and then push, and then breathe again. So if we think about the labor for justice coming in a rhythm, like how are you resting? How are you breathing? Who are you breathing with? And then how are you pushing? And then we don't go to battle alone. We don't give birth alone. Who are you breathing and pushing with? Then showing up for that labor, fighting for a more just world like our ancestors did, with our grief, with our rage, with our imagination, that itself makes for a meaningful life. For this is what I know to be true. We need sound government and we need just policy. But in order to deliver the world we want, in order to sustain those policies, we need a shift in culture and consciousness, a new way of being and seeing each other that leaves no one behind, a revolution of the heart. And that means that anti-racism is the bridge, but beloved community is the destination. And for that, you can live into that now with the way that you're meeting up with your friends and talking through the night in your dorm rooms, the way that you're showing up in your classrooms and your student activities, the way that you're imagining making a meaningful life for yourself in service of others. You can become beloved community in the way that you live your life now and the way you do it with the people you love at your side. So that is my message to you, is to imagine a life where you see no stranger, where you love others as much as you love on yourselves, and you let that love sustain you.
Push and rest. Thank you, Valerie, for those words. Dr. O, we'll keep the conversation going on Twitter. I know we don't have time to do it here, but thank you so much on behalf of the panel and panelists. And Dr. Sellers, back to you.
First, I want to thank you so much, Soledad O'Brien, our wonderful panel, Rihanna, for moderating such a impressive, thoughtful group of people. I just wish we had more time for even more discussion. I'd also like to take this moment to thank our other student performers for their moving rendition and performances this morning. I can think of no better way to start off this important week of work than what has happened this morning with our opening assembly. I know that we are near out of time, but I do want to take one quick moment, as this will be my last DEI Summit Community Assembly, to thank not only the wonderful people who it has been my great pleasure to work with over these years, but also to thank you, each and every one of you out there who have been a part of the university's efforts to transform to an institution that is more diverse, more equitable, and more inclusive. While I am deeply, deeply proud of the work that has collectively been done during DEI 1.0, I must tell you that I am even more excited about our future with DEI 2.0. DEI 2.0 will build on the many successes that we've already developed, as well as build off of the lessons, the hard-earned lessons that we've learned in terms of things that haven't worked as well as we would like. We are in a much better position as an institution to do even more, despite the fact that our DEI 1.0 is still seen as the model by which other institutions of higher education are looking to see that transformation. We know that there is tremendous amount of work that's still ahead of us, that we are nowhere near where we need to be as an institution. At the same point in time, though, I can tell you with all complete confidence that we are no longer the institution that we were when we started this journey. And the reality is that this journey is a journey that will be multi-generational, just as the development of systemic racism has been multi-generational, just as the development of other systemic forms of oppression. And to really be serious about dismantling structural oppression, one must be willing to be in the fight for a long period of time, to fight it on multiple fronts, and to recognize that that path forward is not linear, but it is inevitable to continue to fight forward. So with that, I want to close out our morning session, our community assembly, with a invitation for those of you who feel comfortable enough to come out in person. I invite everyone to the Trotter Multicultural Center later this afternoon from 4:30 to 7. There'll be a carnival celebration of the 5-year plan, an opportunity to hear some great music, hear some people talk, some spoken word, some comedy, and most importantly, to commune together as a community as we move forward in this struggle. With that, I want to thank you and hope that you have a great next few days. God bless.